This lecture, I'm going to be going over this particular game between Richárd Rapport and Baadur Jobava. So, the name of this class, if you can remind me, what is it called again?
Chess in the 21st century.
Chess in the 21st century. So, the reason I picked this game is because you could not possibly find more 21st century players than these two. Richárd Rapport is a Hungarian player who's basically one of the best players in the world, and he's, I think, not even yet 20. Very, very strong player from Hungary. And Baadur Jobava is a bit older, but also an elite player. And recently in the Olympiad, he won the gold for first board. So you could imagine that he had to beat a lot of strong players. But I was actually looking forward to this because I'd say among the elite players, not among, every chess player on the planet, probably not. But amongst the elite players, these two are probably the craziest. Meaning that they do not play normal theory. They kind of make things up as they go along. They're very, very creative. And this type of player, I would say, really didn't exist too much. I would say that they, in coffee houses and in, chess clubs where, say 1,600 players, people around that level are playing, there are players like this. But at the elite GM level, there are so few. And this is something which I think is kind of new. So I thought we'd go over this game. It was a really interesting game. But some of the decisions they'd make, I would say if you were to ask 9 out of 10 Grandmasters, they'd be like, what? But these guys do it, and not only do it, they do it well, and they get away with it. So let's see. So first of all, d6, knight c3, e5. So what would you guys play here as white? Knight f3, perfectly good move. I like it. Any other good moves? Also an excellent move. f4, of course, is what Rapport played. Remember, these guys are maniacs. But okay, what opening does this look like? The King's Gambit. What I find interesting about these players is that they're completely modern players, but they have actually a lot of classical leanings. They like positions like the King's Gambit, which at the elite level, at least nowadays, doesn't exist. But these guys still play it. So, pawn takes pawn, knight f3. So how do you normally play a King's Gambit? What kind of move do you look for here? Well, you took this pawn. What's the idea of the King's Gambit, by the way? Does anyone know? Usually, right? Sometimes you can give back the pawn. For example, against the King's Gambit, I happen to like this system where you play d5, you exchange the pawns in the center, and you basically make it so white has no initiative, which you'd know about if you attended my last lecture. But you're not very greedy. You don't really hang on to the pawn. But usually in association with d6, you play a move like g5. And you try to hang on to this pawn. But it makes sense, right? Because this pawn is not just a pawn. It actually prevents this bishop from getting out. So for example, after a move like d4, you can play, g4, by the way, has to be considered, of course. But even if you just play bishop g7, you really have a strong hold against this bishop. This bishop now can't really develop. So not only do you take the pawn, but your pawns are kind of hitting the bishop. Of course, there are drawbacks to playing like this, which means your king is not as good, right? But again, these guys are a little cuckoo. So g5 was not played. Any guesses what black played here? All right. So knight e7. Kind of a strange move, but the idea is to just guard this pawn, right? But I really don't like this move. It takes way too long to guard the pawn like this, and I think it'll be taken later anyway. So d4 was played, normal looking move. Knight g6. It's so funny too, because if you saw this position and I knew the pairings for this round, and you would ask me which game this came from, I'd immediately say Rapport Jobava. Would not hesitate, because only these guys can play like this these days. At the top level again. So knight g6. Bishop d3, which again I thought was kind of a weird move. To be perfectly honest, I don't know what's wrong with even just knight d5 and taking back this pawn. It looks to me like black's going to have just a terrible position. Because, I mean, look, white has the two pawns in the center, right? Black can't really challenge it. You can just take this pawn. Bishop c4 also looks normal, but okay. Rapport Bishop e7, castles, knight d7. So once again, I'm curious what you guys would play here. Again, knight d5 is the move that occurred to me. I'm sorry, knight d5 was played. It was this position where something weird happened. Yeah, of course. I mean, I didn't even mention knight f8, which looks kind of insane, but we're all just skipping that. No, I mean, probably black should just castle and say, all right, I'm just worse. But, like, what would you guys play here as white? Like, what's a normal move? Sure. I mean, I understand that you let the knight out, technically. But come on, you have the 2 pawns in the center. They're not being challenged in any way. You can move the bishop back wherever. This looks fine. White just has a very, very comfortable advantage. But again, these guys, one of the things that they do is they try to not just play... I mean, okay, a lot of positions you have to just play good moves. You don't have a choice. But one of the things they try to do to opponents, and again, it's a newer trend, they try to kind of give them difficult choices. They try to make life difficult for them. And they also play very aggressively. So I can tell you almost for sure, Rapport thought, well, this guy, he's just putting his pieces on the back rank. What is he doing? He wanted to punish him really severely. So he did not take this pawn. Played queen e1. Which to me looks a little strange, because I'm not exactly sure where that guy's going just yet. But black played knight e6. White took the bishop. And now the position's getting kind of weird, right? Like it's not entirely clear how you're going to win this pawn back, no? So how would you proceed? Well, first figure out what's going on here. Which, by the way, is not such an easy thing to do. What exactly is going on in this strange mess of a position? White's down a pawn. Very true. Does white have any compensation for this pawn?
Yes.
That's a great answer. Can anyone be more specific?
Yeah, better if black's pieces are active and his king is missing.
Very good. So black's pieces, I wouldn't call black's pieces not active, but they're a little weird.
Yeah.
You know, they're not exactly, I mean, they're both defending this, they're doing a great job of defending this pawn, I'll put it that way. But other than that, the knights look a little strange. White has the 2 pawns in the center, and the 2 bishops also can be very powerful with the initiative. So the question is, though, what should white do? Is this a position for white to play slowly? Do you think?
No.
Why not?
He's down material, so he has to show justification.
Right. Now, sometimes when you're down material, you have long-term compensation. So what's the difference between long-term and short-term compensation? It's where it's a matter of tempi. Like your opponent, for example, if your opponent not being castled, that's not something that's permanent, right? They can probably castle in a move or two. It means it's going to go away, which means you want to be quick about it. So the 2 bishops, I'd say white has some long-term compensation. The 2 bishops are definitely long-term, but that's about it, which means that white should really be trying to stir up an initiative. So those of you who have been here for over an hour already know exactly how to do that. So how do you stir up an initiative? That's... Alright, stir up an initiative doesn't necessarily mean commit suicide. There's a difference. Yeah, G4, I don't get what you're accomplishing. It looks kind of crazy. The only person who could possibly play it is Rapport. I will give you that. However, I don't think it's a good move. Okay. And this move actually is quite good, I think. Well, G4, I think your pawn's going to be too weak there. You need at least one pawn shielding your king. So, H4 is actually a very, very nice move. So the reason why is because a move like E5, you know, okay, it technically tries to open lines, but it doesn't do that much by itself. H4, on the other hand, actually is very clever because now black has to make a tough choice. Now, I'm actually very curious because What Jobava chose, I don't think I'd ever choose here. And I know you know it, so keep quiet if you can. But try to, like, what exactly is white's idea of h4? It's actually very simple. h5, to drive the knight away and maybe try to take this pawn. Not to mention maybe developing an initiative. Now, normally moving pawns in front of your king like this can be dangerous, but remember, it's a king's gambit, you're playing for initiative, and it's not like black can really do that much with these pieces. The other nice thing about h4 is it prevents knight g5 ideas in some positions, trying to trade off the knights and get out the bishop. So this move actually has a few purposes. However, what would you do as black? Because you have quite a few, you don't just have one option. I'm pretty sure I know what I would play, but I'm curious what you guys would play. I'm with you. I do not want to allow h5. I would almost certainly play h5 myself. And I'm really not sure how white can take advantage. Now, it's true, this knight now is a little looser. Castling can be kind of nerve-wracking with a pawn here. But at the same time, white has a pawn here as well. I think the position's really just a mess. I don't think either side has the advantage. By the way, if you had this position as white, wouldn't you really have rather taken this pawn earlier and just had a nice advantage for nothing?
Yeah.
But these guys don't think about it this way. But Jobava chose to castle. Apparently, he thought this knight on h8 was going to win him a beauty prize or something. But to me, it looked just really embarrassing. So I don't know. I mean, again, it's just the reason why I'm showing this game is just because like these guys really kind of encapsulate modern chess almost to an extreme degree. I do not think, I would not choose to allow this. I don't think most grandmasters would choose to allow this either. I don't think I'm alone on this one. I think Jobava's in the minority. But the point is that these guys think about chess differently. They're more like, for example, I'd say chess maybe 30 years ago, they would not even look at this. And the reason why is because, a knight on h8 that can't obviously get back into play, maybe h6 comes, maybe that 4 pawn hangs. They wouldn't allow it almost out of principle. Like, a knight on h8 can't be good. A lot of players still incorporate this into their thinking. But what modern chess has more than it used to, and this is obviously caused by computers to a large extent, because computers will often tell you, knight on h8, who cares? Now, computers don't like this, I can tell you for sure. But there are some times where it's just, okay, it looks ugly, but you have to prove to me it's bad. And if you can't find exact variations, concrete variations which prove it, a lot of things are totally playable. I've had positions where, say, I have a huge attack, I'm like, this has to be great, and the computer's just laughing at me, saying, nah, there's no mate, sorry. Or positions where I think that I'm clearly worse, and the computer's like, nah, you can just defend with these moves. It's no big deal. And sometimes it says, put the knight on h8, who cares? And it's one of those things where, again, it's truly a 21st century thing, because it used to be people just didn't play these moves on principle. And again, I'm talking mostly about elite grandmasters or international masters, at least people of master level. But it used to be just you don't put pieces here. Now it's like, it's a knight on h8. It's not going to kill you. Again, I would not do it, but hey, he won the game, so who am I to argue? In any case, I think that black's position's a little suspect here. I'm being kind with that wording, But okay, the interesting thing is that it is Rapport, which means that he's probably going to do something nuts anyway. So he plays e5, which makes sense to me. Opening up the bishop, right? Incidentally, a move like queen g6, a threatening mate, could be really embarrassing at the wrong moment. So black decided he wanted to lock things up. So, what would you guys play here as well? Because this move would probably not have been my choice either. c4 is actually what was played in the game. I don't think it's a terrible move, but I don't think it would have been my choice. And the reason why is because this position is not like the others, in that I do not see a way for black to repair his position. Yes, the pawn on f4 is kind of hanging, things are messed up, but I just don't see a way for black to repair. I think that you do not have to be in that much of a rush. So in the interest of taking your time, what's a clear improving move? I like this move very much. I think this would have been a little bit more dangerous, actually. But okay, c4. He wants to go at him right away. And by the way, this is not totally an inhuman way to play. Takes. Rook d8. And this is the thing with these guys, which they do really well. And something which I wish I could do better, actually. Which is that these guys do not panic at all. One of the things about, because every single game they play insane positions, do you think they're gonna go crazy if they have a really bad position?
No.
They're used to it. Believe me, these guys see more bad positions than any of us, probably. But they're still elite players, you know? Very, very strong players. And the reason why is because they handle these positions so well. Rook d8 is actually an excellent move. And it was really like the main way to stay in the game here, to cause problems. Because now, white would love to play d5, but there's a problem. And the bishop hangs. So white decided to take this knight. But do you think white really wanted to take this knight?
No.
Probably not, right? Because now the light squares are pretty weak. So that's why I think playing with bishop d2 was a little more clever. But queen takes. Queen to h4. You could take the pawn, of course. But he wanted to attack the rook first. Finally, he takes the pawn after all this. So what's happening here?
Well, black's getting mated, so...
Mated? What do you mean? I got a knight on h8. How could I ever get mated? Oh, no, that's with the knight on f8. Sorry. There's a saying, actually, with the knight on f8, you can't get mated. With the knight on h8, I don't know if it applies, but I would say that there are two ways you can try to handle a piece like this. You can try to play for checkmate, but there's another way to play, which I often find is the better way to go. And actually, I recently used this trick in my other games. When your opponent has a bad piece, one of the tricks you can do is actually try to trade off every other piece. Trade the rooks, trade the bishops, trade everything, and leave your opponent only with their bad piece. And you'll find often you can win very easily because they're basically playing a piece down. And I used this trick actually in a recent game. It was actually more clear than this was, but it made my life a lot easier because basically I was like, I just wanted to trade off the pieces. I didn't even think trying to go for the initiative or trying to go for the third. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to trade off the pieces and leave them with this knight on h8. So it's actually not such a bad idea. However, the main thing is you want to make sure this knight doesn't get back in the game unless you absolutely have to. Make sure that knight stays out of the game. If you play a move like h6 and allow knight g6, that's probably not going to be good for you, right? Because you better make sure you're mating, let's put it that way, because you're letting your opponent's piece back in the game. You want to keep this guy here as long as you can. Leave it there to rot. So, black played queen g4. So what now?
Take it.
You want to take it? So you don't want to checkmate anymore? Well, I guess the alternative is playing queen h2, which is a little embarrassing, huh? But he plays rook c8, rook c1. So the queens get traded. Now, how does the queen trade affect the position? It's actually a good question.
Wait, so what happened there?
You were going to ask what happens if rook takes d4?
No, what happens after rook takes d4 and bishop g4?
Well, first of all, the rook on the 7th is very strong. The other thing I would say is that you're asking for trouble. And the reason why is because the game is complicated now. The pieces are interacting. It's going to be a mess. Why is that so bad for black? Yeah.
He's not developed.
Yeah, this knight on h8. If everything goes crazy and each side starts making threats, black's going to have to live with this knight on h8. It's not going to participate. It's like having some huge battle and one of your soldiers are just sidelined, right? You're probably going to lose it. So black's whole idea here is to keep the position closed, because then the fact that this knight looks, less than stellar, is not as big of a deal, right? Because the position is locked. There's no way to take advantage of it. So this is a nice trick to use if you ever end up with a piece like this. We all do once in a while. Thankfully, I can't remember the last night I had like this. I'm sure I've had a few. But c6. White plays back. So now what? Got to get stuff out, I assume.
Bishop g4.
It's a possibility.
Bishop a6. Bishop a6.
Yeah, black tries to go on the initiative here, which seemed a little strange to me. But again, I mean, these are the moves that would occur to me too. Bishop e6, bishop g4, trying to take this pawn. I mean, but rook b5, he wants to gain another tempo attacking stuff. So b3.
Bishop e6.
So this is actually an interesting question. Why did he play this? So this is definitely possible. It's kind of weird because normally a move like h6 is a good positional move. Why is that?
This is a pawn.
What pawn wedge?
Even for one.
Why is this normally a good positional move?
Because you create holes.
Yeah. So for example, forget the knights for a moment. The bishop has the holes, the king's not as comfortable. This kind of thing is usually very bad. However, here, black can play this, which normally is a weakening move. It opens up the king a little, which even in the endgame can be a problem. But this knight on h8 can now go to g6, right? So you're letting your opponent's piece out, which is why I actually don't think white should be playing for that. So my guess would be that Jobava wasn't necessarily afraid of h6, but he thought that bishop e6 he could play anytime. And he wanted to make sure this pawn stayed here so that at least in the future he had a potential weakness. Again, personally I think this is a little bit dangerous, because now playing f6 is going to be really difficult with this pawn hanging. But again, that's why these guys think about chess a little differently. So okay, rook c3. So white wants to be able to think about attacking this rook and maybe slide the rook over to g3, which seems pretty logical to me. So what now? This move also has a tactical point, which I'd like you to find. So what's the idea?
Also, if he plays bishop g4, I think you can take on h6. Yeah. But he can take on h5.
This move has to be considered, right? Because not only you're trying to win a pawn, you're trying to free your piece. So one move that has to be looked at is bishop takes c3, h6. So now if pawn takes, this is probably very bad for you because, and if f5, there was a, yeah, just take the knight. My trick for you was, I don't know if it works, but don't allow this. But you can just take this pawn and then the bishop's going to fall. So taking this bishop back would be ill-advised, so probably you should take here. And now, any ideas? Rook g3 is very tempting, that's for sure. But I'm curious what you do if I just bring my knight out. So the funny thing is, I think that Jobava played this move rook b5, which looked a little weird, just so that after knight f5 type moves, there was no knight e7 forking. Pretty clever. Start with this. So here, at first, it looks like black's totally safe, right? But I don't know, you have to look at this move, no? So you see how even in the endgame, the initiative can kind of persist sometimes. In this particular position, though, I think black maybe survives. Play this move. The point is that at first I thought rook takes f7 was quite strong.
Wait, so what happened to f takes, or e takes f7?
We'll get to that. After rook takes f7, there's this move, unfortunately. Without this move, black would be just busted because this bishop's going to fall. After pawn takes, I think the move is king g7. So you probably get a queen. Yep.
Bishop, you're spinning that. Take that.
But I think that black is doing fine here.
It's probably a draw.
Equal material. This d pawn's maybe even a little weak, if anything. But okay, the king comes here. Should be fairly drawish, I think. This would be quite a way to end the game, huh? So actually, it's a very good question, what happens after all this. I mean, it was a very long game. I analyzed specific parts of it for the lecture. This particular move I didn't look at. But it's kind of an interesting question, right? Because, I mean, if he can't take this pawn, I mean, he'd love to take this pawn. But I looked at all sorts of things here. Like, for example, after knight g6, I have other ideas to try to, even like, for example, bishop takes pawn. With the idea that after king takes, knight check, and no matter where the king moves, I thought that I could win the bishop maybe. But I'm not even sure that's possible. Although after bishop takes g7, there's knight takes h4, which actually puts a damper on things, to say the least. But even here, I can't be totally sure, because after bishop f6, maybe you can try to play for checkmate by bringing your rook up. So for example, rook f4 to h4, rook here somewhere. These positions just get so crazy and so fast. But clearly these guys saw something. He played rook a5 instead. And then rook back to d5. So whatever it was, he did not like what he saw. So white played knight f5. So white decided no more of that. Takes, takes. So I don't know. I still think that white has an edge. This knight on h8 is still not fixed. But it's not so easy to take advantage of. But okay, this position, rook e8, g4. And I believe this was the position where I really would not have played the way Jobava did. The question is, what can you do here?
G6.
Well, g6 is possible. But now, keep in mind, you've made this guy weaker. So after rook f6,
King G7.
let's see. Definitely possible. But you don't have a major, you're not fixing your knight, right? The main problem in the position you're not fixing. So let's say I improve my piece. I'll play rook back, I don't know, c2. Until you improve that knight, you're going to have problems, right? That knight's just sitting on h8, hating its life. So try to do your friend a few favors there.
F6.
Yeah.
Yay.
And you don't even have to do it immediately, but this was definitely the idea I came in mind with. Rook e6, king g2, and yeah, I think this is the position I wanted in. Yep. f6. So what's the idea? Apart from breaking up the pawns, what's your main goal here?
Is the knight squaring back to e2?
Yeah. The knight wants to get in. That's the main thing you're accomplishing. So when you have a bad piece, and this is actually a question to always ask yourself. Now, I'm hoping, for your sakes, most games you do not have a piece like the knight on h8. That's basically, you don't want a piece like that. But in any chess position, if you're stuck, if you're not sure of what to do or what your plan should be, ask yourself, what is my worst piece? And usually you'll come up with an answer, and usually improving your worst piece is going to be a good move. Oftentimes, I use that technique myself. There's some position I can't figure out. I ask myself, what piece do I really want to improve? Usually you'll come up with an answer, and improving that piece is the key to making your position stronger. When you have a piece like a knight on h8, it's a different story. In a lot of positions, say you have like a rook on a8 that's not in the game yet. Sometimes you can play a couple extra moves or even several moves without improving that rook, because you can improve it at any time, right? A knight on h8, your mindset should be fix this now. Every single move, it should be like a red alarm bell going off in your head. Fix, fix, fix. Because otherwise you're going to leave that knight on h8 the rest of the game and be very depressed. So f6, yes, it may weaken this h6 pawn. It may have other problems. But fixing this knight is completely, is so important. Because, okay, white should probably take this, but now you can even take this guy. The knight comes back in. I mean, you could even end up better if these guys are weak.
Wait, so what happens after? Oh,
Sorry?
sorry.
Okay.
I thought like F7 was the half
Yeah, it doesn't quite work. So yeah, f6 was definitely the way to go, I think. He played a6, which to me is a little nuts. Like, you're really moving a pawn over here when you're But again, these guys are something special. So king g3. Any guess what move I would play? You guys are good. All right. He played g6, which is actually interesting. But, so the idea now is there's no rook f6 because this rook covers. So yeah, I mean, this was kind of weird. Probably white should actually take this. It looks really strange to let the knight out, but the point is that even though the knight gets out, black has another severe weakness, which is this pawn on h6 is just going to fall. So this is another technique which you want to be aware of, which is sometimes your opponent has something bad about their position, but they're going to fix it. You know, there's nothing you can really do about it. So what you do is you actually exchange one advantage for another. In this case, you exchange the fact that this knight was bad for the fact that this pawn is now weak, and you're probably going to win it. It's never easy, though, to let a piece like this back in the game. So I really don't blame him for playing a move like this. He played rook f3 instead, which makes sense, right? He wants to keep this knight bad. But unfortunately for him, it's not so easy. Pawn takes pawn, and f6. And finally, this knight's going to come back into the game. So it's taken probably way too many moves. But the key is that eventually he really did want to fix this knight. So rook takes. Takes. So now what?
So what happens if the bishop takes h6 instead of...
In this position?
Yeah.
It's possible, but I think you might experience some problems here. Because after pawn takes pawn...
Rook f8.
Okay. So unfortunately, your bishop's attacked, and I'm threatening pawn takes pawn, and then I might be the one playing for the win, no? So, and in fact, that's exactly the kind of thing that happened. Rook takes h5. And here was actually, it's starting to get to important moments, because what's happened? What's transformed in the position? Right, I would say that these two pawns I think are fine, but these two pawns in particular I think are very weak. So for example, if we get a position, even if these guys trade and I end up with a knight on d5, you could end up defending for a long time. And these are the type of danger positions where I think that a lot of players will mess them up, which is that your position was so good, it was so promising, but now all of a sudden it's a mess. It's so easy to think, to kind of go into the mindset of, you know, you're still trying to win a position you shouldn't win. And it's so hard to kind of transform your thinking because white had such a big advantage for so long. But he allowed f6, he allowed the game to transform, he allowed all of this to happen. So now the game's changed, and white has to actually be the one who's careful. So the question is, what should white play here? Very nice. So the idea now is if the rook moves away, what happens? It's okay? But you're trying to get this rook into the game, right? Rook e5 is possible, but I'd like to play d5 myself. Trade off your weak pawn, right? Takes. And all of a sudden, the rook comes to d7. I mean, white's doing totally okay, right? What happens if I take your rook? Yeah, so probably you'll end up in an ending like this. Now, you have to be careful. This pawn is kind of a little bit bad, but it's probably better than on d4, right? So the king kind of slides over. The bishop can guard it. I mean, probably it's at least a holdable endgame, right?
No, just bring a bishop to e7, bring a king to c4, and then just move your bishop.
Right. I mean, once the king gets here, it's going to be pretty hard to win. Probably the king will even stay on e4 to keep this king out. But the point is that it becomes drawable. But again, I think that he wasn't thinking in these terms necessarily just yet. He played king g4 and did this. Yeah, so here, I didn't get why he didn't move his king up. Almost always you want an active king in the endgame. Maybe he was afraid of this. And honestly, it actually is a very human decision because this bishop looks pretty bad to me. But at the same time, I think that he really had no choice. And the bishop can get back. It's not like it can never get back. But he played backwards, and now he ended up at least having to defend. Because even though you're the one with a passed pawn, this pawn is clearly a weakness, not a strength, right? So king g4. So yeah, here was another moment where I thought he had to backtrack. Be like, okay, I'm going to play 3 versus 2. But he gets something similar to this. So, sorry I'm going fast, but the end of the game is kind of complicated and I wanted to cover it. Yeah, this is another thing. Knight e5 was kind of a mean move. Because normally, would you like to trade the bishop for the knight as white?
No.
It's actually an interesting question.
Yeah.
Why?
Because the bishop isn't much use here, and rook games are easier to hold.
I'd say kind of. I'd say it really varies, but in general, yes, you want to aim for the rook endgame. Rook endgames in general tend to be very drawish. When you have all pawns on one side, a knight sometimes is better than a bishop, but it will give at least greater winning chances. Yeah, but don't trade the rooks. Trading the rooks is going to be very bad. Actually, if you trade the rooks, you might be able to hold with like king on c2. If you trade the bishop for the knight, you should almost certainly be able to hold. What you will not be able to hold is the king and pawn endgame. That will be lost every time. And it's just one of those things. Like if you're down a pawn and a king pawn ending with lots of pawns left, I mean, you have to calculate it, but I would say, almost 100% you're just going to lose almost all of them. So the key is to either have a rook endgame or bishop against knight if you have to. But the reason why Jobava played bishop e5 here is because bishop takes, rook takes is a mistake because, yeah, you have to trade the rooks, right? So that's why he waited until king e2 to play knight e5. So he played rook e4 instead. Knight d3. So they got this kind of position. And here, probably black should actually have played knight a2 and knight back and then kind of continued. Black's obviously better trying to win, but it's not clear that black can actually accomplish this. But it's one of those positions, if you're black, you play forever. If you're white, you have to defend forever. And it's just, if the king could get back, probably you're drawing, but it's still not going to be that easy. But note how this king's cut off as well. So again, it's just tough. But Jobava decided to trade off the rooks. And at first, this looks like a great decision, because after this, he plays here, and he wins a pawn by force. But believe it or not, because white has better king position, white should actually draw this. Just because this king is so close. But what it means is that white has to play accurately. So here's my question, and I'll even flip the board just for you guys. How does white draw? Because it is really not easy. And to give you an idea of how not easy it is, he lost in a matter of a few moves. Just to, lighten your spirits. Well, you correctly remembered the move played. And then what happened was, a5 looks like a nice move, right? Securing these pawns, ready to take them. The problem is that the king will simply head for b5. So he played a different move here. But after king b6, king c4, everything's held together perfectly, right? And the knight can just take this pawn at will. This pawn can be pushed. You have no chance. So that would be an example of what not to do. So a5 was not the best move. There are many. So let me show you kind of where the problems are. So first of all, if you allow black too much time, the king will simply come in and you're not going to have a chance. So you have to go after these pawns.
Yeah, that was the first one that comes to mind.
Right. And it's what he should have played for sure. So there are a couple different defenses, king e6 and king e4. Let's go for king e4.
King b6.
But here is where do not rush. There are many, many moves, all of which look reasonable. Only one of them draws. Oh yeah. You guys thought you were going to have it easy tonight. No.
Bishop g6.
I just gave you like the hardest problem of the night and you come up with an answer in like a second? Alright, fine. I'm afraid to play it though, because then you'll see it.
I want to cover the b4s.
All right, bishop d6. Let's analyze. Bishop d6, knight b3, knight d3 check. King d5. The fact that you allowed a tempo move probably means you're already losing, right? And this is one of the key things to learn. When you're choosing a square for the bishop, like if you do choose a bishop move here, the key is that you have to, it's almost always important to be accurate. Because for example, if you put it on a square where a king can attack it while improving itself, you probably just gave up a whole tempo. Position like this, you can't afford to give up a whole tempo. But let's look at the most direct move first. King b6. The most direct, right? You're just going to go after these pawns and say, whatever, I'm going to take your pawns and draw. It would be wonderful. However, what happens after king to b6? Knight a2. So what's the idea of knight a2 if I play king b6?
You can protect the 2 pawns. And,
You mean from the b4 square is what you're saying?
yeah, but the queen king can't get back.
Ah. It's an interesting idea, actually, because after knight a2, king b6, king d5, if
It's white's turn.
it's white's turn, sorry. Yeah. But after, where are you? Oh, after king b6, knight a2, I see. Yeah, because if king takes pawn, knight b4, bishop d6. There's a5, but then I can attack your a pawn. So you don't quite have time to hold the pawns that way. But you're actually, that's an important idea. The key is that the knight here is not stable, right? The question is, what is the stable square? Very nice. If you get knight b3, pawn on a5, king d5, it's just over. Because the pawn on a5 is secure, the pawn can just push. All right, let's examine the moves one by one. After king b6, king d5 is the move, with the idea that takes an a5.
Bishop c7.
Then knight b3, push pawn. So that does not work.
You went back too far. We're back too far.
Ah, that's true. Yeah, and if king e6, this move is actually very strong. So king here. Now, yeah, bishop g3. But the reason why this is the move is not so simple. So, yeah, king b6 doesn't work. So you need to find a bishop move. But for example, most squares are bad. For example, bishop c7 occurred to me. I mean, it keeps an eye on the pawns, right? Makes sense. The problem with the bishop here is that after knight b3, the king has to go back, right? Because if king b6, you play which move? I was thinking king d5, or a5 rather, right? If king b6, a5 takes king d5, the same position. The knight guards the pawn, this pawn's ready to roll, right? So the king goes back, and now the problem is the knight goes here. So king c5 looks like a reasonable move, but it has a problem with it. Correct. Which is why this is not a good square. See what I mean? So bishop h2, trying to get it so out of the way, makes sense. But now there's actually a way to win. You play knight d3 check, c5,
The bishop can't go.
and the bishop cannot get back. Correct. If king takes, you actually have a very nasty move. If c3, then bishop d6 holds, by the way. But you play check first, and then c3.
No, knight b4 check is more.
And now the bishop can't get back to guard this pawn. Very embarrassing. So, quite the variation. Now, this is why you have to go to g3. By the way, the odds of finding this in a game, not very high, even for players of this caliber. However, it's mostly to show like how precise you have to be. And this is something which, it's so difficult to do even with time. But the key is you need to use a technique which is basically process of elimination is the way to find this. You're not going to find this move out of sheer brilliance. If you can find this move out of sheer brilliance, then you're on your way to be challenging Carlsen. However, the easiest way to find this move is to eliminate moves. King b6 we saw just lost, right? Bishop c7 we calculated, lost. Bishop h2 is more complex, but you can calculate that as well. When you start eliminating possibilities, you have to go, well, what's left, right? Bishop g3 ends up being your only move. Sounds very exhaustive, and it is. But it's actually sometimes easier to eliminate moves than it is to calculate the correct one. So oftentimes, if you're looking and looking and looking, and your time's ticking down, go with the move you're not sure doesn't work, right? Any move you know loses, and it's pretty obvious. I mean, don't bother, right? Keep looking and find the move which at least is challenging. Bishop g3, believe it or not, holds the draw here. So the idea is that if knight d3 check now, and you go down this whole path, it doesn't work because in this position, knight c5 check fails. And why is that? Yeah, and then c3, trying to queen again.
Bishop e1.
Very nice.
It's so
Notice how the bishop on h2 could not get there.
And it's a draw.
And this you should be able to hold.
That's easy.
Easy to hold, is it? Anyways. So that doesn't work. Knight b3 check looks like a reasonable try. But then the king goes back again. Back. a5. So if king b6, knight b3 again. But you have this move. And now, knight b3 check, king back to c4. And you actually hold. I'm actually very curious about this now. Now that you were claiming it was so easy, I want to test you. So I want to play knight c5. Go ahead. So show me how easy this is. So you say you could never lose this, right?
Yeah, well, if you just keep on pushing your a pawn.
Okay, go ahead.
Now, bishop g5. I'll play. I have an a pawn, so.
That you do. I cannot deny that you have an a pawn. But I think you're actually losing. Because knight d2 cannot be stopped.
No, then I should.
Which means, where did we make the mistake? Knight c5 check.
Yeah, no, you don't want to go d5.
No? Alright. Where to go?
b6. You lose your pawn. a5.
You lose your pawn, but is that the end of the world?
Oh. No, but you get the pawn back. Sort of.
Not quite, but you remember, you don't actually have to, you don't actually have to win. You don't have to use your pawn necessarily to draw. You just have to get your king and bishop to make sure the c pawn doesn't queen.
Does this win? So c2.
Alright, hold on. Sorry. So c2. Bishop here. King d3. So bishop, I think,
I think just go away.
go away.
f4 loses.
That's kind of rude.
I'm going to f4.
Alright, fine. I'll go away.
That's kind of more rude.
So the idea, by the way, is that if here,
Oh, yeah, king b2.
in this position,
F king b3.
king b3 and king b2, I was thinking though bishop back to c1. So now the bishop can negate. There's no blocking it. But what's the idea after king b6 and I push again? And I try the same winning method I did before?
Yeah. Bishop e1.
And what's the difference? Because the king... Oh, still lose. Sorry.
Sorry. Your king needs to be on b7.
Yes, it does. If a7, queen here. If king b7,
Queen there.
I check. And by the way, you guys know if the pawn gets to a7, it's a draw, right? With the king here.
True.
But unfortunately, with the pawn on a6, it is a win. So,
Wait, go.
what do you do?
I'll play king b6 still.
Mm.
I think I need to play king b5 to get closer. To get close.
Oh, I actually figured it out.
Oh.
King b5 is fine.
You have to play, okay, bishop e1.
I fed you the wrong move. At least I think so. I did. Bishop e1's not the only move.
Oh.
So just to show you guys what we're talking about, after c2 now the bishop guards from this square. So when you play knight b3 you don't gain a tempo on the bishop,
So then you play.
which means you can push your pawn.
Push the pawn and you're not doing it.
Pushing the pawn works. It's not winning.
Slowly.
But now you can take and play to a2, a7. That one extra tempo is all it takes. Bishop h4 is actually very clever. And the idea is that now, if you play knight d3, for example, you play this move, with the idea that now on c2, you can at least shimmy back and hold. But you can see how, and by the way, even this is not even close to the tip of the iceberg as far as calculating this. So again, you can see why it's not like, well, bishop g3, how can you possibly see all this in a game? I mean, there's no way I would see all this. Zero chance. And that's if I had 45 minutes. The key is, how do you figure it out? How do you find this kind of move? The way, and how could Rapport have avoided this? Now, probably he was in time pressure, that didn't help. The key is you have to figure out, okay, a5, it loses to this very direct method. King b6 loses to this very direct method. So you find the only thing which struggles, which keeps up the fight, which makes it so that you can't lose. And I'd say that that kind of practical thinking is, if anything, a definition of modern chess, because it used to be they'd try to solve it. But as we can see, it's just often not possible. So using techniques like process of elimination and making sure you look at all the, you basically just eliminate everything that's not completely losing is the way to go. Anyway, very long, crazy game. Not as organized as usual, but I feel like if all of my notes were really organized, it wouldn't pay homage to these players. So.